Hello to everyone who's joining. So as to not waste too much time, I'm going to go ahead and begin. Welcome to everyone. My name is Amy Krupel, and I am the director of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and a Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Florida. Both of these initiatives are funded by the European Commission Erasmus Plus program and are part of the JM in the US network of US Jean Monnet programs. We have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our discussion today is recorded and it will be available on the UFJMCE JM Chair website after a little bit. We will have a Q&A session following the presentations by our panelists, and participants can submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So please be sure to go that route and do not use the chat function. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today to discuss democratic oversight and accountability in the EU. This specific panel is part of the Jean Monnet Chair on Oversight, Accountability, and Democracy in the European Union. For details on other activities supported by the Jean Monnet Chair, please visit jmce.ufl.edu. I'm very happy to be able to introduce you to today's panelists. We have Selma Bendabdallah. Dr. Bendabdallah is a research engineer at the Center for Sociopolitical Data, CDSP, at Sciences Po Paris. She is also involved in the work of the Observatory of European Institutions in collaboration with the Center for European Studies and the European University Institute. We also have Dr. Petya Kostadinova. Dr. Kostadinova is an associate professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she also selflessly oversees their undergraduate program. And she is a member of the Comparative Pledges Project, working on Bulgaria, the EU, and US electoral pledges. I am particularly happy here because prior to joining UIC, Dr. Kostadinova was the Associate Director of the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. So virtually welcome back. In addition, we have Guri Rosen. Dr. Rosen is an Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. She previously headed the Secretariat for the EEA Commission at the Arena Center for European Studies and is currently the head of a project funded by the Research Council of Norway entitled Darkness on the Horizon, Exploring the Response to Contestation of Trade Policy in Europe. She's also affiliated with Arena's EU Differentiation, Dominance, and Democracy project. There are, of course, many other accolades that I could say about our panelists, but in the interest of saving time for you to actually listen to what they have to say, I'm going to go ahead and ask them to begin their discussion. Each panelist was given a set of framing questions just to sort of create a cohesive framework for our discussions. And these questions included thinking about the relationship between information, transparency, oversight, and accountability in general, and whether or not these relationships are different in an EU context. I also asked our panelists to think about whether or not EU-level actors and institutions should be subject to the same level of oversight and accountability as their counterparts at the national level, and to what extent oversight and accountability over EU institutions and actors should occur at the individual, partisan, or institutional level. And finally, to what extent can or should EU-level actors be held accountable for their lack of ability to represent popular national interests and preferences through their actions and decisions? And our panelists are under no obligation to reply to all of these questions. These were just some broad ideas for them to think about. We will have them presenting in alphabetical order. So Selma, that means you get to go first. I will be muted and be off camera during the presentations.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd like to now share my screen with you. This is about transparency in the EU institutions and through the lens of policy fields. I will explain a bit later on why we have decided to focus on policy fields, on policy sectors, and not through each institution taken individually. So let me start off with a few words about the context. We know that there are more and more tools for transparency, for enhancing transparency within institutions, The toolkit is expanding, especially with the Lisbon Treaty. There are more and more tools. But we also know that during these last 10 years globally, the EU has faced many crises. And many crises, many controversies on economic issues, on migration. These facts are obvious. We saw within institutions, especially within the Council, some divide on migration, an Eastern-Western divide on migration, and a North-South on economic matters. So the idea was to see how the EU institutional machine performs in terms of transparency when there is more controversy. So basically, the idea was to try to define a relationship between controversy and transparency. Does more controversy lead to more transparency from institutional side or not? And as we will see in a few minutes, the relationship is far from obvious and far from easy. First, we know that transparency is necessary for accountability, but whether it's sufficient or not is another story. We know that transparency is necessary, but more than transparency, the quality of information is key. Be it information on final decisions or information on preliminary agreements or progress reports for ongoing negotiation processes. So it's not just transparency, but how transparency is dispatched regularly along the negotiating process, the legislative process. Second, we don't know whether policies have an influence on this quality of transparency. For instance, should we say or can we say that some policies are better in terms of qualitative transparency or not, or are policies not a key or pertinent variable to observe to determine the level of transparency within the EU? Second, as to the relationship between controversy and transparency, as I said in introduction, the relationship is far from clear. We know on one hand that context matters, of course, and that EU actors, MEPs especially, are more watchful on more controversial pieces of legislation. So politicization, in one hand, increases the information supply. But on the other hand, we also know that transparency of debates at the EU Council level pushes the minister into consenting to legislation that they might have opposed behind closed doors. So on the one hand, we have in the literature a relationship between controversy and transparency, but on the other hand, transparency does not mean more controversy. So that's why we intended to explore these relationships through the lens of sector of policy fields. So we have decided to focus on three main policies that were highlighted during this decade, and two of them might sound a bit more controversial than the other one. We have the Eurozone and the migration crisis, which have been highly debated on, discussed on for having fueled Euroscepticism in the public, and for having seen a significant proportion of European citizens blame the EU for their economic condition or for the negative distributive effects of EU policies. And environment, on the contrary, is another field where there is a high public pressure, but where consensus among European citizens seem a bit more obvious. So to observe this relationship between controversy and transparency at the EU level, we relied on the project Professor Krepel mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the Observatory of European Institutions, which basically covers almost 30 years of decision-making in the EU. So we have around thousands of data which have been accumulated in this observatory, and which allows a researcher for finding what are the main driving processes in the legislative process. We have focused on a range of indicators. We could discuss on that a bit later, which might signal more or less transparency in the EU legislative process. Of course, we have focused on trilogues because we know that these instruments are not always used in the same fashion, which of course obscures the proceeding of interinstitutional negotiation. We know that, for instance, the majority of trilogues is not reported back, although the EP requires the negotiator to report back, or not in time. So we have thought that it might be a good indicator of the quality of transparency. We also have focused on public hearings because, of course, it's a way to demonstrate the relevance as a political authority, but to communicate information and to exchange with the public as a whole. We also have focused on fast-track procedures because during these crisis times, we have a huge record of fast-track procedure by the European Parliament, and we also have focused on public vote in the EU Council because we were thinking that the fact that the crisis has a bit decreased the reluctance to be seen in dissent might lead to an increase in opposition to past legislation from ministers' side. So, of course, all these indicators are not on the same footing. Some of them are more critical. I mean, the public vote in the Council is more structural to the way EU institutions negotiate. It's also a way to reach out compromise with the other institutions. So, of course, it's not the same way that, for instance, public hearings, which is more on the EP side and on the way day-to-day functioning. So now I would like to show you some results we have drawn from the data we have. So here is the results on the EU Council votes. So we have focused on the three policy fields I just mentioned: economy, environment, and justice and home affairs. On the first graph, you have the proportion of votes where one member state opposed or abstained. And in the second part of the graph, you have not only the proportion of abstention of opposition, but when there is more than one member state which oppose or abstain at the EU Council level. So what we see here basically is that overall environment, which seems to be a more consensual issue, shows more opposition or abstention vote from the ministers. But when we look at the bigger coalition, we see that justice and home affairs, which is not a big surprise, seem a bit more controversial than others, and mostly that minister don't have any reluctance to show they oppose or abstain. So in this issue, there is no secrecy or no reluctance from minister sides. We also have, here is the proportion of minority opinions in the EP. So when minority opinions are written in the written reports, we have decided to pick this information up. And what we see here is that contrary to what happens in the council, economy is where the minority groups are more inclined to show and to express their opposition, and do not hesitate to make this opposition transparent in written reports. So on two very different criteria, we see that institutions have their own logics, and most than all institution policies have their own logics when it comes to observe transparency. So now moving on to the criteria of trilogues. So economy, environment, and justice and home affairs are the top 3 committees were involved in trilogues. And so we have decided here not to focus on the number of trilogues for each policy field, but when each trilogue publishes the report on time. And so we have focused on whether there is a report or not after the trilogues. And we see that, well, justice is the policy field where there is a bit more report, interim report, progress report than the other policy field. So here you also have some elements on the public hearings. And here you can see very obviously that environment is where hearings, public hearings are more frequent, more often dispatched through websites, through videos, etc. And finally, I would like to save some time for the conclusion. We have the facts, the figures on fast-track procedures, where, well, it's very, very thin, but we can see some differences, and especially that justice also seem to be the policy field where the European Parliament has a stronger record of using this tool. So what consequences and what takeaways, to be very brief? So as you can see, the picture is very, very blurred. It's very complicated to draw one pattern of transparency. We see that, well, policies have their own logics when it comes to determine what kind of transparency tools are used by institutions. And I think it has an impact and influence on how citizens are able to, of course, determine well, the accountability of each actor, because it's very complicated to say, well, in economy, the European Parliament prefers to use fast-track procedures, but in justice and home affairs, it's completely different. So each institution may have its own logics, but more than that, policies are completely autonomous in that way. The second point I would like to draw is that we have seen a lot about this trade-off between transparency and efficiency, where to be efficient, less transparency would be required. The data we observed are not really giving a clear answer, but what we see is basically that at the EU Council level, this is not automatic at all. We have taken many decisions in Eurozone crisis and in justice and home affairs migration crisis, but still we can observe some public votes. Ministers made their vote public, so to signal something to lobbies or to public opinions. And the last point is that overall, all these statistics, all these figures are very low. So what it means is that the EU legislative process is still even maybe more negotiation oriented. And we can say that in times of crisis, there is maybe a greater necessity of compromises. And of course, compromises might be held behind closed door, which is not a good sign for transparency. And so I'm done, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Selma. Alphabetically, Petya, we go to you. Are you ready?
Yes, great. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone for being here. And thank you, Selma, for your presentation. It actually speaks to a number of things I wanted to highlight as well, which is actually nice. But I'll start with a perhaps less known anecdote. But when I think about these topics, it strikes me, and it's different in different languages, but not every language that I'm aware of has actual word for accountability that is separate from the word for responsibility, right? Bulgarian, for example. I don't know about many of the other Slavic languages. So this is a word and a concept that they can be foreign, particularly for voters, and particularly in contexts where what is the difference? Yeah, responsibility seems a little bit more narrow. Accountability seems to imply maybe higher level of responsibility, maybe some legal, some moral, maybe serving on behalf of someone. Accountability also seems to imply changes in behavior, either proactively to avoid being sanctioned by those that you're serving, or retroactively to remedy the cost of those that have been affected. But it is, I think, important to acknowledge that in the context of democratic principles and trying to enhance quality of democracies, of institutions and polities and processes like the European Union, it's tricky when just maybe the word doesn't exist in your language. Think about it. And so I wanted to put that up front there, because I think it's an important consideration. But there is something special about accountability, particularly for elected officials, or particularly for non-elected officials, right? Elected officials can have other processes to be held accountable through the ballot box. Non-elected don't necessarily have that, and that's where things get a little trickier or more complex for the European processes and for the European Union. And as Selma pointed out, transparency is necessary for accountability. It's often not sufficient. We don't quite yet know how to measure it, which is a good thing. There's a lot of opportunities for further research here, because it's very tricky to measure accountability in particular. Transparency may be a little bit easier to capture. Public hearings, media reports, transparency can also be seen as actors proactively informing their constituents or the public for their decision-making processes, trying to be self-transparent, be proactively transparent. But that can also come with limitations when actors are proactively transparent. They might only be selectively. They may be being transparent selectively, and that remedying that could require stronger involvement by the public, by the media, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But one other area that I wanted to stress, and I think that speaks more directly to what Selma was saying, is that there are perhaps some areas where transparency is not as desirable, or can be riskier to expect transparency in decision making. Obvious one is personal privacy for decisions that affect individuals, and it's kind of not as relevant here. But a couple other areas where transparency is a little bit trickier to insist on is whether it can endanger security, right? Matters of highly sensitive nature, policies of highly sensitive nature, where you don't necessarily want everyone to know what were you thinking when you're making that decision. And especially in crisis situations, that can be a problem when actors don't engage in the level of transparency that they expected. Yet it's a situation that can be highly sensitive if transparency is provided. And the second area where it can be a little tricky is in areas and policies where compromise is the norm or desirable. And again, speaking more directly to what Selma was saying, there are many areas, particularly in the European Union, compromise is necessary for decision making. And are actors going to be able to make decisions based on their true preferences or true representing someone that they're supposed to represent behind closed doors versus when it's out in the open? And evidence seems to be mixed, but there's certainly reasons to expect that actors might not be as genuine in their decision making if they're expected to be transparent. So transparency can compromise or minimize their desire to compromise wherever decision is questioned. And so that's another consideration that's again perhaps even more important in the European context, where more so than in single party governments, you are expected to compromise. And that's how things move forward. And again, the evidence seems to be a bit mixed to that end. But it is something important to consider. What makes the European Union again more difficult to both think about it, these issues, measure these issues, capture these processes, is the enormous complexity of the institutions and the processes, the connections between them, who does what, and especially from the perspective of citizens, who is responsible for what. Citizens can be very confused what is in the purview of the European Union, and therefore they should be held accountable for it versus what was my local official supposed to do, and vice versa. And to remedy that, to make it easier to follow, easier to promote these processes of accountability, it's quite demanding on citizens. It's quite demanding on voters. And that's where I think media needs to come in. We don't study it as much in political science and political processes in terms of what is the role of the media for enhancing transparency, promoting accountability. Certainly there's been a lot of the visibility for high profile malpractices, high profile corruption issues. That's not the shortcoming. Where it becomes more difficult, more interesting is the day-to-day processes and day-to-day activities, and what is media paying attention, what are voters paying attention, and so I think that makes it less demanding on the citizens themselves to be able to expect accountability and transparency from the European Union and European actors. But it requires a more active role of media, as well as nonprofit organizations, citizens groups. We know that businesses are fairly active in terms of engaging with European institutions, but civil actors the same, engage to the same extent, and is more engagement by citizens, by civil actors, going to promote more transparency. It's going to make it less costly, both for voters and for the institutions to engage in that. And so that's the second line of thinking, and within my thinking, and the related, more specific area that I wanted to give as an example here is particularly in terms of monetary policies and the others highly complex processes. And so I appreciated Selma's focus on policies rather than the institutions, because I think that's where the difference, I agree with you, that's where the difference can become more pronounced. And monetary policy comes to mind, to my mind, as that, because it's something that most of us don't understand. I know some of us study it, so certainly voters, and there are certainly good, strong reasons to keep some of these policies non-transparent. Most democracies have independent central banks for reasons. You don't want day-to-day politicians meddling in that, but that also makes it more difficult for those to be transparent in terms of the complexity that they have, and also to be to hold someone accountable for actions that you don't understand. I think that's really comes to the crust of the difficulty with some of these policies, and again, some of these processes, when most voters, even most observers, some scholars don't quite appreciate how difficult a decision might have been. How are you to hold those who made it accountable? Are you supposed to? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't have a straight answer, but I think it's an important consideration with that. And in the end, it comes down to trust, right? If you trust your policymakers, you might be less likely to expect outright transparency for every step, and you might be less likely to be holding them accountable. And for the things that I've been involved in, this is where partisanship comes in. And having political parties as an important process for accountability is obviously critical for democratic entities. At the same time, there is some evidence in various research arenas that voters and people tend to trust their co-partisans more than those from the other party. And so if it's your party in charge of a policy making, you may be less likely to hold them accountable, less likely to expect transparency, and then you only hold accountable the non-co-partisans. And that further makes it far more complicated, both normatively and empirically. But it's an interesting process, an interesting dilemma. And throwing in, so in a way, in that sense, having non-partisan actors be involved in transparency, processing, and accountability is perhaps remedies for that, but at the same time it removes that process even further from voters, and perhaps alienates voters a little more. So certainly there's a role for parties. Parties play an important role in promoting the linkage between voters and policies, even in the EU context. But when we throw in accountability and transparency and the role of partisanship, especially in highly polarized settings, and in highly controversial, conflictual settings, that's something that we as scholars need to be watching for. I'll pause here. I have more to say, but I'll pause here and we'll continue on later on.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Yuri, can we ask for your contribution?
So first of all, thank you, Amy, for organizing this panel and for allowing me to take part in the discussion. I thought I would try to say something about the conditions for accountability in the European Parliament. And I'm going to try to use some examples from my own research on EU trilogues and a bit about the EP's gathering of expertise. So just on background, throughout the development of the European Union, EP has struggled to achieve a position on par with the European Commission, but particularly with the member states in the Council. So the EP has become quite skillful in exploiting formal and informal factors to empower itself. And it has achieved a lot. It's been described as one of the most powerful parliaments in the world. But we can argue that it's come with a price. There's this paradox of the European Parliament becoming more and more powerful at the same time as European voters seem to lose interest, right? They're not showing up at the ballot box, although there's an increase in turnout, albeit a small one, in the last two elections, and we can discuss that. But the point is that the European Parliament has increasingly become part of this debate about the EU's democratic deficit. So I wanted to focus on different so-called, I call them balancing acts, that I think the European Parliament needs to grapple with, or is grappling with, in trying to correct for a lack of democratic accountability that is at the core of the deficit debate. And common to these balancing acts, that it is about the European Parliament and what it can achieve interinstitutionally, as opposed to how the EP as an institution manages its relationship to EU citizens. And one such balancing act is between internal and external accountability. And I think this is highly visible in the context of trilogues. So Selma talked about the trilogues. They've become this standard operating procedure for reaching legislative decisions in the EU. And it's seen as a key mechanism for reaching quick agreements between the two legislative bodies, the Council and the European Parliament. And they're defended because they provide efficient settings where decision makers can discuss more freely, but they're also criticized for blocking open and inclusive decision-making processes. They've been described as both opaque and as unaccountable, sorry. But in a recent paper I wrote together my co-author, Anna-Elisabeth Stia, we ask whether our assessment of the trilogues also depend on what normative standards we hold them against. So we ask how and to what extent do trilogues meet the standards of democratic accountability. And accountability is a key part of democracy. It's been mentioned. It's ensuring that elected officials remain responsive to their voters, right? That's the core of of accountability. And there's this much cited definition of accountability by Mark Bovens, describing it as a social relationship between an actor and a forum in which an actor has an obligation to explain and justify his or her conduct. The forum can pose questions and pass judgment, and the actor may face consequences. So this definition of accountability underlines that accountability is about providing justification in this assigned setting where it's expected the principals and agents meet or face each other regularly. So it's about a relationship between an agent and an accountability forum. But then at least when we talk about trilogues, there are two accountability relationships involved. It's the internal accountability that refers to relationships between actors within the European Parliament itself. And then there's the external accountability that refers to the ability of citizens, civil society, other relevant stakeholders to hold MEPs to account for their decisions in Parliament. And trilogues present a problem both to external and internal accountability. Externally, these are closed, secluded settings. So it's a problem to the public visibility of legislative activity in the EP. And internally, it's a problem to the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, who are not present in trilogues, who are not part of the negotiating team dealing with the Council. So there's been a lot of measures taken in the European Parliament over the years to improve accountability, especially, lights go off here, sorry, can I move a bit? It goes on again. Measures taken to improve especially internal accountability. And these are measures such as mandating procedures, reporting back mechanisms was mentioned, and expanding the composition of the negotiating team. But this does not necessarily add to the external accountability. So what we do in the paper is that we demonstrate how and why there's this mismatch between increasing internal and external accountability by assessing these two types of accountability from two different understandings of democracy. There's democracy as political equality that emphasizes the importance of political equality, inclusion of different voices, different interests of citizens, other affected parties. But then there's also democracy as epistemic quality, that we call it, that values the epistemic function, which is to produce decisions that are informed by facts, by logic, decisions based on relevant reasons. So this epistemic strand is more concerned with improving what we can call truth sensitivity of decision-making procedures. So essentially that the best available knowledge informs lawmaking. And the point here is that these different perspectives on democracy place different normative demands on accountability, both internally and externally. And then one example is transparency. So transparency, it's been said, it's necessary for accountability, but the two understandings of democracy can be said to require different kinds of transparency. So democracies as political equality would require what is called transparency in process that allows the public to scrutinize the behavior of elected representatives during the entire policymaking process. So negotiations, reason giving, voting. The epistemic strand would have a higher tolerance for informal, secluded settings if they contribute to strengthen the quality of decision-making outcomes. And what is important then is that the accountability forum is organized to promote explanation, promote justification, so that these types of negotiations can be exposed to diverse epistemic viewpoints. So internally, that would be to MEPs with different competences, different experiences, and externally, it would be to other competent actors. So in other words, from this perspective, it's more important with processes open to competent actors and not affected parties. So this requires a type of transparency in rationale, where substance, facts, reasons for decisions are exposed, but not the entire process. So in the paper then, just to give you some of the empirics that we use to assess the possibilities to hold the EP to account, we focus on formal procedures, and we also zoom in on some of the same committees that Selma mentioned that deal with a lot of legislation. So in terms of internal accountability, there's been markedly strengthened by European Parliament reforms, especially concerning the negotiation team. This has become a lot more diverse, both politically, but the European Parliament also seems to place a weight on the experiments of the members of the parliament that take part in negotiations. So in that sense, the composition of the negotiating teams partially or meets both the criteria of political equality and epistemic quality, at least that's what we argue. But what is lacking from both perspectives is the quality of the accountability forum. And this is an arena that internal and external accountability dimensions share. So there are some differences between committees, and it has to do with policy area, I think. Some have a more thorough mandating process that would allow for closer scrutiny of what parliamentarians bring to the negotiation. But overall, there is very little information provided during trilogues. So trilogue negotiations are, for the most part, presented, but they're not discussed in any sort of publicly accessible EP setting. So neither, what we find that neither at the committee level nor at the plenary level is there a function, is there an arena for justification and explanation. And this means that negotiations cannot be properly appraised from different political or from different epistemic viewpoints. So in other words, in terms of external accountability, trilogues fail to meet both normative standards of democracy. So in our paper, we wanted to treat these two perspectives on democracy not as antagonists, but rather as contemporary challenges that modern societies face. And one could ask to what extent it makes sense to treat the two normative standards as equally important, or if there's a hierarchy between them. But I still think that the balancing act between political equality and epistemic quality might be particularly relevant for the European Parliament. And I just want to show you some research that I'm doing at the moment. So some argue that the European Parliament is actually more dependent on being able to demonstrate an adequate level of expertise compared to national parliaments, because the EU relies on expertise as a source of legitimacy. And we know that the EP is heavily dependent on the European Commission for information and expertise. But I think there are also indications that the European Parliament is attempting to bolster its own supply of expertise. And this figure shows research provided to the European Parliament, from both internal and external sources. And as you can see, there's a large increase from 2013 onwards. And that's when the European Parliament established the EPRS, so the European Parliament Research Service. And I think this is an indication that it's trying to sort of compensate for the lack of source of expertise, because you could also argue that MEPs are removed from this party source of expertise. It's cut off from, not cut off, but it's removed from the larger party organization that you would normally rely on for expertise, either because also because we know that the contact between MEPs and their national parties varies and largely depends on issue salience. So the point is, or where I perhaps finish is the question of whether the European Parliament can ride two horses at once. It comes back to the balancing act. Does focusing on building expertise to control and influence the executive come at the expense of the electoral linkage? There's this quote by Weber, in every mass state, democracy leads to bureaucratic administration, and without the introduction of a strong parliament to bureaucratic rule. But on the other hand, parliaments can become too strongly preoccupied with managing bureaucracy, with controlling bureaucracy, and too little with the task of performing their democratic duties vis-a-vis the citizens they are set to serve. And quoting one of my other colleagues as well, studying the European Parliament, Christopher Lord has argued that the EP has managed to become a working parliament. It has really strong committees. It has a track record of influencing policy, but partly because of this, it remains a parliament with an unclear connection to its own public. And I think this really illustrates the very difficult balancing act that the EP has to grapple with and the different types of accountability that it has to cope with. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all three of you. I'm going to take the chair's power, whatever, and pose a first question. We have a few questions now. I'd like to leave the opportunity open for more people to post questions, but I want to pose a question, which is one of my framing questions, but I think we skirted around it and we didn't quite get to it, which is there's much made of the failure of democratic accountability in the EU, and in particular, a potential lack of connection between members of the European Parliament or party groups in the European Parliament and citizens, and the democratic accountability that comes with that. But my question remains, if there is general consensus that the EU, while a political system, is not a state, then should we be expecting the kind of accountability and oversight that we are used to seeing at the national level in the best of circumstances, that we hope to see at the national level in a democracy? Is it a fair thing to expect that level of oversight and accountability? Is it a useful thing to expect that level of oversight and accountability in the EU qua EU, but in the European Parliament more specifically, or, you know, Patty, I know you work on the Commission as well, and other institutions. So I will leave that open to all three of you and just ask if you want to chime in or not. In the order, alphabetical order. So Selma, you don't have to answer. I'm just curious.
Well, my answer won't be clear, okay, but I would say that it is not always fair to expect from the EU the same level or the same kind of accountability or transparency we are used to, but it remains that there is strong expectation from citizens, and how we can deal with that expectation if we are not dealing with the same way we are used in national spheres, in national domestic arenas. So I don't know if this is fair for the EU, but what to do with these strong expectations? There is a growing Euroscepticism. We have seen that European citizens blame more and more the EU for negative economic conditions, for instance, or for crises that happen. So what to do with that? And I think EU institutions have their answer to afford and to make.
Okay, Katja?
Yeah, great question. That's something I didn't get to in my 12 minutes. So thank you for that. I'll answer your question, but first I'll start that there's some evidence that there are actual attempts for linkages between voters through the political groups and policy outputs. That's something I've studied a little bit. both in the context of the political group and then the links with the commission. So, for example, we find that when we look at specific actionable election promises made by the political groups over time, there is no overlap between those and the proposals that come out from the commission. It doesn't mean that everything gets followed through, but it does indicate that the commission tends to, in formulating its policy proposals, tends to get input from the political parties through the political parties. That is a good thing for democratic linkages. And it additionally, this overlap, this interconnectedness seems to be higher in areas where voters consider that policy to be the most important problem facing the European Union, and also in areas where there is more opportunity for civic groups to be consulted by the DGs. So that's, again, very sort of limited focused evidence, but there's some suggestion that those exist. So I don't think it's fair I know that not everyone knows about these things, particularly not voters, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that the linkages are problematic between voters and the European Union, the European Parliament in particular, where it becomes perhaps more difficult to answer is whether the EU should be treated as the same as other democracies, or perhaps more and not less, right? It makes some very important decisions, a lot of important decisions that impact voters. And while on one hand, national standards for accountability probably shouldn't be applied to the EU, certainly not without kind of a blanket application. But I would think that there should be processes to hold EU actors accountable in the same way national actors are held accountable.
Okay. Good.
Okay, yeah, I agree. It's a good question. I think that you could also ask the question whether some of the democratic normative standards that we put up were too strict, full stop, right? Both in national terms and in European terms. But I would say that I think that the EU is also creating its own expectations, right? So it's claiming to be resting on, it says in the treaties that it rests on democratic principles of representative democracy through the people and through the European Parliament. So just by that, it sort of kind of creates its own expectations and some of the expectations that it needs to fulfill. And I also think that, if not fair, but maybe following up on Petya, that it's even more important for the European Parliament to create this kind of, or to be wary of the accountability and the democratic legitimacy, because it's supposed to take all of these decisions, cross-border problems that the nation states can't solve themselves, right? But these are also super difficult and super difficult decisions that will be highly unpopular to a lot of people. It doesn't mean they're not necessary. It just means that sort of it becomes more difficult to legitimize and perhaps even then more important. So I would say that perhaps it's even more important for the EU to live up to its democratic credentials. And I think that there are also serious efforts to do that, right? Both in the European Parliament and in the European Commission.
Okay, I'll take a question from the audience. I'm merging two questions to a certain degree. There's interest in knowing to what extent there are actually efforts to undermine or stymie transparency. The questioner doesn't specify why that might be, but are there actors that might benefit from the lack of transparency? I would argue internal or external. And are there tangible efforts to sort of stymie the efforts that are being made to increase transparency, potentially in the name of efficiency, right? In the name of increasing efficiency. And this time we'll go in reverse order. So I'm springing that one on you, Gary. Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess that, I mean, the easy one would be secrecy. First of all, I think that I've been studying secrecy as well, secrecy in especially in security policy and external affairs, and that you can really see what's interesting about the European Union always is that there are so many differences between the member states. So depending, you can say it almost depends on member states. They have very different historical traditions of openness and transparency, and that really has a bearing on and has had a bearing on the European Union. I think that there's still this argument about efficiency and having that space to think. I think that's still a quite heavy argument at the European level, and it's hard to sort of get around. Perhaps not that much interest either in the European Parliament, especially not in the Council, to get around it. I think there's also something to be said about space to think. I don't know. I just don't know where the space to think stops. I think it's also visible, but Selma and Petya, please correct me, but I have the impression that at the council level, the rules for transparency in legislative matters has sort of meant that they retreat into other informal settings where the real negotiations take place. So that kind of maybe touches upon some of the issues that Petya was talking about the difficulty or the tricky issue with transparency and when compromises are supposed to be made. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but perhaps I can come back.
All right. Oh, Petya, you get to go second, just generally. Sorry.
Yeah. So I don't, to the questioner's question, I think it's going to be very hard to observe any active efforts to undermine transparency because those would likely be secret. But the one thing I wanted to stress, and many are aware, sound like a typical Eastern European, but there are concerted efforts with disinformation coming at a European public from an outside actor. There are outside actors who benefit from having democracy destabilized and having the European Union look like a mess. So while I am not aware of any specific efforts to undermine transparency internally, I think we should all be cognizant that the European Union is a war, informational war, if not physical war to a large extent. And so keeping that in mind in terms of active efforts to undermine the European Union and its processes are ongoing through media and other disinformation and misinformation.
Okay, Selma.
Okay, so I will try to step into Petya and Guri's shoes, but I would say that I won't see any incentives for undermining transparency. I'm thinking about the EU Council level, where we are used to reading that Council ministers want to avoid transparency in the name of efficiency. So they would like to decide behind closed door to be more efficient, and so to be more able to reach out compromises. But to me, there is no clear link or clear evidence that transparency means less efficiency. When we are talking about representatives of COREPER or whoever, they are not saying that transparency is very costly in terms of efficiency. They are saying that, well, they have many incentives from national parties, from domestic national spheres, and so that's why somehow they need to decide behind closed door, but that doesn't mean that they do not want transparency. So I don't see any prospect or any evidence that this is a trade-off between transparency or efficiency. I think both could go hand in hand.
Okay, I'm going to burden you all with one last question. We'll let Petya go this time, just because. You mentioned, and it's because you inspired it, I think, you mentioned about the differences that might exist between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in terms of thinking about democracy and misinformation and transparency. So I'm wondering whether you all think that expectations regarding oversight and accountability and their significance for democracy, whether there are significant variations across member states, whether that's old, new, north, south, east, west, what have you, and the extent to which that poses challenges then for ensuring that expectations for transparency and accountability are met, again, by the EP, by the political groups, by the Commission, or by the EU as a whole. So we'll go category Selma.
Great question. I haven't seen public opinion data on that. I'm sure it exists. I will stop answering. My thinking is, excuse me, as many of you know, the EU gets blamed a lot in Eastern Europe. The EU made us do all these things to qualify for membership. And so it's I wouldn't say necessarily means that it's held to a higher standard, but I think a lot of then the processes, if a scandal happens in the EU or something doesn't seem right, the popular, even if it's not a majority, certainly the popular sentiment would be, well, you made us comply with these rules, but you're not complying with them yourselves. So I think that's certainly a permeating narrative in a lot of Eastern European countries, certainly among voters who feel that they are not heard by the national leaders, because national elites are generally pro-EU and supportive of these processes. Voters, particularly in the smaller cities, villages, tend to, as in other countries, tend to feel forgotten and neglected, including by the national governments, including by the European Union. So there's a both lack of understanding of what the EU is, what it does, what it's responsible for, and perhaps a higher level of expectations for doing things that that people might not be aware that the EU should not be doing or expected to do. So.
Okay. Great.
Again, a really interesting question. I think that it's a question of bottom-up Europeanization to a certain extent. I mean, at least from the Scandinavian point of view, when the Swedes held the presidency of the EU in 2000, they really pushed hard for openness, and they managed to get it, right? They managed to push through a regulation of openness and principles for openness that went quite far. And I think and rules stick, right? So, and I think there are several examples of that also within the realm of external relations, where just by switching, I won't say where, but just switching maybe the head of a certain department, you get new tradition in, and those rules stick. So I think that's an interesting dynamic at the EU level, and with the parliamentarians as well. We've really seen that these kind of parliamentary networks, maybe not at the in the European Parliament, but the national networks of parliamentarians, that's become a source for information sharing. So, and maybe also for sharing of expectations vis-a-vis the executive. I remember from the negotiations on TTIP long ago, but then there was this major push for transparency in an area where it's normally really, really secret, right? And you had the European Parliament that gained access to documents, and then you had sort of a domino effect of national capitals where national parliamentarians demanded the same. And it kind of, I can't remember. I'm not saying that it sort of it was access for some, access for all, but it was definitely a situation of access for some, access for more. So they could kind of piggyback on each other and pushing their own governments at the national level for gaining access to documents. So I think that there is the interesting EU dynamics at play, but definitely being driven by pro-transparency, pro-openness governments.
Contagion effect. All right,
Contagion
Selma.
effect. And something hard to be against as well, right? At least publicly.
Yeah. Selma, any last thoughts?
Yes. Okay. So I have a quick look on the last Eurobarometer polls, and what strikes me is that We are used to reading about the Eastern-Western divide, about the global image of the EU, and that the global image would be less positive in, let's say, Poland, Hungary, etc. But the last Eurobarometer poll shows that the country where the level of support for the European Union is decreasing, whereas in some other country it is increasing, is France, which might be quite surprising if we are used to thinking about East and West and so on and so forth, Eurosceptic countries. But the fact is that in France, whereas in Greece or in Hungary, in Poland, the level of support is quite the same or is increasing. In France, it is decreasing, and it's one among the most Eurosceptic countries now. So I don't think there is a different expectation around North, South, East, and West, but as regards transparency, as regards accountability. But I think that in terms of blaming EU for not taking actions rather efficiently is a better indicator of a strong divide. And in France, for instance, we are asking for more efficiency where in fields where the EU has no power, namely security, defense, and foreign affairs. So that might be another way to answer the question.
Okay, well, I want to thank all three panelists and our erstwhile audience who have remained. I was aiming for 1:15, so we're very close. As everybody is leaving, there is an exit survey, so if you can just take a few minutes. And I would also encourage everyone to keep a lookout. The Jean Monnet Chair has an ongoing series on democracy and accountability. This is our webinar. Next up, we will have a series of talks. Those will be recorded and then posted on the website. And with the our panel in person at that time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. I hope you have a lovely evening or a good rest of the day, depending on where you are. Okay, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.